Hello, welcome to Demi Tastes. I have to mute the Instagram tab. Uh-oh. Stop making sound in my ears.
It's always something.
It wouldn't be a stream if everything went smoothly the first time.
Oh, never.
Oh, okay. There are multiple echoes. Okay. Nope. Where is that coming from?
I promise it isn't me this time.
Don't look at me. I just got here.
I have no idea. I'm so confused. Sorry, bear with me. I can't talk when I'm in my own ears, delayed by 5 seconds.
All right, what should I pour? Since we're working at technical difficulties, I haven't decided what to start the evening on, and
Okay.
I figured.
You good?
I think so.
Yes,
Perfect.
excellent.
Okay. Sorry about that. So canned intro's out the window, but I'll do it anyway. Welcome to Demi Tastes, where we do a little bit of tasting and a lot of talking. Usually we talk about whiskey, but the best thing about whiskey are the conversations that we get to have, and we get to talking about a little bit of everything. So we have as our guest today Reade Huddleston, who comes very recommended as an expert on many things in the industry. I've seen it for myself. He's in a Discord server that is extremely geeky for a lot of producers, and he started pretty much every topic thread that I checked out on every geeky topic, questions I never even thought to ask. So I'm going to try to ask some of those questions today, and we're going to go real nerdy with it today. I think this will probably break the record for nerdiest Demi Taste podcast episode so far. I'm really looking forward to it. So before we go any further, Reade, could you please introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about what you do?
Yeah, absolutely. So my name is Reade Huddleston. I am the Director of Distillation and Spirits for Monster Brewing Company, a wholly owned subsidiary of Monster Energy. Yes, we are in the alcohol space. However, I'm also, as Doug kindly mentioned, on the board of directors for the Society of Spirit, which is a nascent industry organization, and I've got about 13 years in the distilling industry. So I spent a lot of time with a lot of people around spirits of all kinds.
So that's a great segue to the bottle that I'm going to pour first today. When I looked you up earlier, I found out that you were involved in blending the Good Deeds Malt Whiskey, which is a blend of American single malt whiskeys, benefiting the Step Up Foundation, which felt appropriate to mention because it is still Women's History Month. And among other things, the Step Up Foundation supports bringing women and other minorities into the distilling industry, or into the alcohol industry. Via training, internships, and so on. Is there anything you'd like to say about that or this bottle?
Oh yeah. Well, first off, I'll get into this. I'll say a word about the Step Up, and then I'll say a word about bottle. Step Up is a great program. It's really a cool way to get people that don't normally have easy access into the industry. Access to the industry. They get to do these cool internships. They get to work at all these places. They get access to a lot of people that they wouldn't normally just get access to, and it's created some great distillers. One of them being Erin Lee, who now works at Few. I actually found out that the way she got into Step Up was that bottle that's at this last ACSA. I had no idea, which made me all the more proud to be part of that blending project. So the Good Deed Spirits kind of grew out of, there's an informal organization called the Good Guy Distillers, and it's a bunch of distillers that just want to help, just want to be friends, just want to share good knowledge. And I've been lucky enough to be a part of that organization for a few years now. And at the time I was working with Headframe Spirits, and I don't remember who it was, but someone just kind of threw out a comment as Step Up was starting saying, hey, how do we support Step Up? And the realization, both selfishly and selflessly, was that, well, why don't we make a whiskey? Selflessly, we wanted to give all the profits. So there was absolutely, the glass was donated, the corks were donated, the labels were donated, everything, all the profit went to the Step Up Foundation. But also, selfishly, it gave us a great excuse to all get together and 10 distilleries got involved. I actually, now that you're pouring a bottle, I'm kicking myself for not grabbing the last little bits of my bottle. I'm down to the last remaining like quarter of it, and I really should just go ahead and drink it. But 10 distilleries were involved. They all submitted whiskeys. We 3 of us got together up in Montana, which is where Headframe is, in Butte, Montana. And it was Johnny Jeffrey, Randy Hudson, and myself. Johnny Jeffrey being of, at the time, Bentley Heritage, now Minden Mill Distillery, and then Randy Hudson of 888 or Notch Whiskey. And we sat down, and honestly, I was a little worried when we sat down that first day. I was like, man, there's 10 different distilleries, 10 barrels. This is gonna be a mess. We have no idea what we're gonna make. And honestly, in about 40 minutes, we came together and we're like, this is how we blend this. This is what we do. This is the amounts we take. And we all really liked it. And I'm trying to remember the number of bottles that we ended up making off of it. But we took it and we blended it together with portions from each of those 10, proofed it down. We had to wait a couple months before we could get the bottles and the labels and everything. And then people came back out and packaged it. And it was just a big old fun party. And I'm really proud of that whiskey. It raised some good money, but also it was, I remember the quote that I said after we kind of finished blending it. And I say we kind of got it in 40 minutes. We spent most of the day working on it, but within the first 40 minutes, we knew the direction it was going to go. We knew where it was going to happen, what was going to happen with it. But I turned to Johnny and I was just so happy. I was like, man, we made scotch. And he was like, what? He looked at me and was like, yeah, you're kind of right. And it wasn't so much that we had made scotch. It was that, and we weren't trying to mimic scotch, but what was amazing was that you had these 10 unique distilleries and they all came together and they blended well, and it made something just as coherent as a standard blended scotch. And not just as coherent, but just as good, like good, if not better. And we actually did debate entering it into some certain competitions. And we decided that we really wanted to just support the Step Up rather than have our own ego stroked by winning medals. Though I do think it's a whiskey that could win medals.
Absolutely. And I think that it has developed a reputation far beyond the marketing, of which there was practically none, right? Aside from the benefit. Fun story about this. Were you at the bash at ACSA or before ACSA?
I was, yeah.
Did you happen to look at the silent auction as it was going?
No, because I ended up having to sell tickets at the door.
Okay. So I am a weird person, and I was curious because there were some pretty high ticket items on the silent auction, and I was curious what things would go for. I myself was bidding on a few things just to kind of start boosting their prices because I felt like people weren't paying enough attention, and it was for charity and all. So I pushed them as high as I was willing to potentially give up money, right? Because many of them were well under retail. Though one of the only things that was well above its retail price was the bottle of Good Deeds that had been donated for that occasion.
That's awesome.
I think it ended up going for more than triple retail price, which is awesome. It just shows that there were better deals on that list, but people really wanted to have a piece of this project.
Yeah, it's one of my proudest projects, and I really was happy with the product that we made out of it and where we got with it. And I'm hopeful Good Deed Spirits does still exist as an organization, because we actually had to do some incorporations and stuff to get it to fruition. And so in the future, there is the possibility of doing more Good Deeds spirits, including whiskeys and rums and all sorts of things.
So you were with Headframe Spirits at the time when this bottle was blended. And as I understand it, there were 4 total blenders involved. You were, of course, one of them.
Yeah.
So out of the 10 distilleries that contributed liquid to this, not everyone was involved in blending. I assume that was a too many cooks kind of situation.
Yeah, well, so it's too many cooks. It was also it was the height of COVID, so we had it was actually a really difficult prospect to get everyone that got there. Randy drove most of the way, and he's from Nantucket. So he drove from Nantucket to Butte, Montana, which is a very long distance to drive because he was just like, I can't get on a plane. I get it. I completely get it. So there was that. That being said, we did have there was quite a bit of communication. Me more so in the sense that I was the one receiving all the barrels, so I had to figure out what was arriving at any given moment. But there was quite a lot of communication among the participating distilleries, and we knew what they were sending, what we were looking for. We kind of had made some decisions about the directions we wanted to go. So I would hesitate to say that there were only 4 blenders. There may have been only 4 people in the room at the end of the day, but there was a lot of participation from everyone.
There's also the aspect of the individuals at the distillery who selected the barrels to send did have a part in the blending process because they chose what they were sending you.
Exactly. Yeah. We knew, and keep in mind, so we had 10 barrels. We did not release all 10, like a release of 10 whole barrels. We took portions of and sections of, so there's still actual product that could be conceivably released under it that's aged differently. A lot of those barrels are still sitting in Montana, but like I said, the input there was input from everyone.
By the way, a couple of notes. While I was figuring out my audio problem, I think I might have killed the Instagram stream, except it looks like it's still running. So I hope if it's still live on Instagram and anyone's leaving comments, I hope I'll see them. And second thing is, Phil, you are a touch loud. I'm not sure if you want to try to do something about that.
How is this?
It's okay. As long as you don't yell at the mic, I think it'll be fine.
Yeah.
Cool. So let's take it back to the beginning. Or I guess probably the beginning as befits your career in the spirits industry. So you graduated with a brewer science degree from Edinburgh. Is that correct?
So I have my master's in brewing distilling science from Heriot-Watt University.
Okay.
And that is not the beginning of my career in the industry. Really we want to go really far back. It's sometime when I was like 14, 15, I started trying to make my own sodas, and my parents can tell you all about the mess that I made in every kitchen that they ever let me into. But I went to school. I went to my undergraduate at a small, tiny college called Hendrix College in Conway, Arkansas. And they were kind enough. It was a very cool school that they let me make my own major. And they also required what were called odysseys, which were 3 out-of-classroom learning experiences. And for one of my odysseys, I chose to work at a local brewery. And I actually did that before I was 21, but I got permission from my parents and permission from the school, and that brewery is called Petty Colas Brewing Company in Dallas, Texas, and they're still some of my favorite people to this day. And I started off washing kegs, emptying mash tuns, washing kegs, and I really fell in love at the time. I fell in love with beer, and I fell in love with the craft industry. And so from there, when I graduated from Hendrix, I realized relatively quickly that I loved working at Petty Colas, but it was a small crew. It's still a small brewery. They were really dedicated to a small area. There wasn't a whole lot of movement for me. And by the recommendation of some of my mentors, they were like, hey, you should look at increasing your knowledge. You seem like someone that really wants to learn this and do this as a full career. You should look into attending one of the professional brewing schools. and I applied for UC Davis and I applied for Heriot-Watt, and UC Davis was full, and it was going to take 2 years. There's like a 2-year wait list at the time, and I couldn't wait 2 years personally. And Heriot-Watt was also technically full, but they had some spaces open up, and I got the offer to go to Scotland, and it was very, very quick. I think within like 6 weeks of me being offered the place at Heriot-Watt, I was on the plane, completely moved over. So I kind of dropped everything, moved over to Scotland, went to Heriot-Watt, really loved my time there, got my master's, learned a lot, met a lot of people, got involved in the industry in a way that I hadn't been involved in before, and really transitioned. I loved, and hell, Michael Petticolis, the owner of Petticolis, can tell you, I always loved Scotch. I always talked about single malt whiskeys and stuff like that. But I considered myself a brewer, and he had said, like, why aren't you going to go make whiskey? I was like, well, I'm just a brewer. Da, da, da. Heriot-Watt opened up the door and allowed me to get really into the distilling scene, and I fell in love with distilling just as much as brewing, if not more in some cases. And then from there, it was off to the races, and just fell deeper and deeper in love. Traveled, being over there gave me the chance to travel around Europe quite a bit. Did a lot of visiting facilities, talking to people, learning things. Hung out in Germany for a little bit. Hung out in Ireland, and then I got a job actually in Canada at a craft distillery in Canada, and I moved to Canada after graduating Heriot-Watt, and I worked there for a little bit. And unfortunately, the Canadian economy at the time, when I first negotiated my salary, the Canadian dollar was about par with the US dollar. And by the time I'd moved there, it was 75 cents on the dollar. So I took a 25% haircut before I'd even started working, which wasn't a great is for any American with student loans. They can tell you that's not a great way to start your career. So I didn't stay there for very long. I moved back to the States, and then I worked at distilleries almost exclusively. I did a little bit of work there, but I also I had always kept my toe in the brewing world. I always had an immense respect and an immense love for brewing, and so I mostly worked with distilleries that also operated breweries, and I hang out with a lot of brewers. So it's a weird comment. A lot of people will be like, "Oh yeah, it's a distiller," and sometimes I have to remind myself that I'm a distiller because, hell, this afternoon I got off of work, and before coming to join this podcast, I had a beer with a bunch of brewers, and we were talking about hops and things that were not that do not pertain to whiskey. It's having that background, having that unique experience really opens your eyes. And there's plenty of people that are brewers that have become distillers, and distillers. There's a lot of back and forth from people. However, I truly feel that I've been able to be grounded in both worlds, and it's been great.
Yeah, there's a lot of brewing philosophy around, especially American single malt.
Yeah.
So the overlap at this point feels relatively obvious to me.
Mhm.
It makes sense that you're still doing a bit of both.
Yeah.
So I wanted to ask, were you tempted at any point in your time in Scotland to give up the idea of going back to the United States and instead try to work in Scotch directly?
Oh, absolutely. I would have loved to stay in Scotland on a lot of levels. The truth of the matter is, I was there for the first referendum when Scotland almost went independent. I voted independent. I can tell you that. And
You were allowed to vote as a
weirdly,
foreign
yes.
citizen?
So that was
Okay.
actually a really cool thing about that, which was anyone with a Tier 4 visa that had spent a set amount of time in Scotland was allowed to vote because you were eligible to become a Scottish citizen. And that's actually one of the big things, and I don't want to get too political. I'm sure someone's going to crucify me in the comments, but One of the big issues that Scotland had and does continue to have, being part of the UK, is the immigration issue. Scotland needs able-bodied, intelligent people to work in specifically the Scottish distilling industry and all of the industries that are important to Scotland. And unfortunately, the rules that exist to immigrate to the UK make it very difficult. So the minimum you have to immigrate properly, or to to be eligible for a visa, you have to be paid a minimum salary, and that minimum salary is very high because of London. London's very expensive, and so they want people to be able to survive in London, of course. However, that doesn't make sense for someone living in the Highlands or in the Outer Hebrides or something like that. Those jobs just can't pay that much. So it's incredibly difficult, actually, as an American, to work in Scotland in the Scotch industry, partially because they just can't afford to pay you. Like, they can't pay you London wages in Aberlour. Aberlour is a great town. You don't need 100,000 pounds a year to live in Aberlour.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Kind of a bummer, to be honest.
Yeah, it really is. And the other truth is, I mean, you've got the difference between Europeans and Americans, North Americans, because it's standard for North Americans to be saddled with a certain amount of student debt. Our starting wages tend to be higher, and our wages just tend to be higher. In Europe, student debt isn't as much of an issue. And more importantly, you also have a lot of safety net of healthcare and things like that. It was hard. I was offered jobs in the UK that I would have loved to take. I honestly was just offered jobs that couldn't pay me enough to cover my student loan.
All right. By the way, we did get confirmation that it is still streaming to Instagram, and that's good for now. So I'm going to keep an eye on the comments there. So far, basically just saying it's there, right? That's pretty much the comment stream so far. So cool.
Somebody did ask if you were able to disclose which facility you worked at in Canada.
Yeah, so I worked with Eau Claire Distillery.
Okay.
And work with some other facilities as well.
That was the only question.
Keeping an eye on that, Phil, because I'm gonna miss it. Yeah, thanks. Well, all right.
Shall we start to get nerdy?
Yeah, let's get nerdy.
All right, we want to get.
Yeah, I think a great question to ask to start off getting nerdy is, what is the geekiest thing you've been focused on in the last week or month?
Oh gosh, the geekiest thing I've been focused on in the last. Well, I mean, technically, I'm in this constant, and I see that Joe's in the comments, and he's heard me talk about it. I'm forever slowly writing this big old tome eventually on still design. So I'm always looking up and researching new stills and specific ways that stills interact. And I think we'll probably get to that. However, probably the geekiest thing that I just had a conversation about yesterday is talking about gelatinization temperature, moving gelatinization temperatures due to drought in malt barley, and ways that small or spot analysis can inform us about the difference in gelatinization temperatures. And so now to get real geeky.
Yeah.
So everyone knows that we need malt to make single malt. And malt is, when I refer to malt, I'm referring to malt in the traditional sense. You can also malt many grains, you can malt all grains. However, malt from malt barley. And traditional education has been that most malt barley gelatinizes, all the starch in malt barley gelatinizes at about 63, 62 degrees Celsius. And gelatinization is just that the starch gets hydrated properly. It gets plumped up enough that enzymes can come in and attack and break that starch down to make the sugar that the yeast will eventually ferment, and then we will eventually distill out. The problem is that gelatinization temperatures differ. They differ among a lot of aspects. They differ among different varieties of barley, but more importantly, they also differ based on how tight those starch granules are packed. So small starch granules gelatinize at higher temperatures than large starch granules. Normally, this isn't a problem because in malting, the small starch granules get eaten first. However, in recent years, or in just any year that stresses the barley as it's growing, though that barley tends to produce different amounts of small starch granules. It also tends to produce just different levels of protein, and protein is what connects all these starch granules and encases these starch granules. And we have seen recently, due to droughts, and especially in 21-22, which was the big drought year for malt barley, and higher temperatures from climate change, we've seen a gradual drifting of gelatinization temperatures upwards. And in fact, we're seeing right now 64, 65. Now, 64, 65 Celsius isn't really a problem most of the time because the standard single malt mash in the UK or around the world is going to go in at about 64, 65. Anyways, the problem comes is if you don't have good hydration and you have cold spots in your mash. So you're adding a lot of grain. By the way, feel free to stop me at any point because I know I'm being very technical and I'm very
Yeah, I actually might just need a minute to ask some questions because I'm absorbing a brand new topic right now,
yeah.
which is exciting and rare, and I don't think I've ever done that on stream before. So everyone's gonna find out how I process information, I guess. So first of all, I want to ask, I guess in recency order, when you say large or small starch granules, what actual size are we talking about here? Like
Oh, these are
clumps of
all microscopic.
right, microscopic, but are we talking like hundreds of molecules of starch? Are we talking like
Yeah,
thousands, millions?
well, so that's a now we're getting really in there. Uh, a starch is lots of molecules connected together. It's
Okay,
lots of
yep.
units of sugar. It's a dextrin. So you've got multiple repeating glucoses, and then you've got amylopectin and amylose. These are long chains, sometimes branching on the 1,4,1,6 kind of branch, 1,4,1,6 branching versus 1,4 just straight chains. That's a good question, actually. I wonder, does it go up to
Paolo
like,
is gonna love this when he gets a chance to watch it.
yeah, it's probably, I mean, I would assume, I've never actually looked at it, but probably like a large starch granule would probably have, uh, upwards of maybe a million
Okay.
glucose units. I wouldn't, but don't quote me on that. I've never looked at how long they really are, or how much is going to be in these. That being said, what it is going to be is it's going to be about 80 to 90%. Large granules are going to be 80 to 90% of your starch, whereas small granules are going to be 10 to 20% traditionally. It's changing. Plants are plants. Different things change all the time. It's amazing how different things are, and we've seen it. I mean, drink some of the Waterford whiskey. They are all about terroir, and part of that terroir is that we know that the same barley grows differently on this hill than this hill. It's amazing. It's great. It's a great example of the differences. But
there are so many tiny little factors that change like exponentially down the road that are really hard to trace.
Exactly. All right. So to throw back to
So I just want one more question.
Go for it.
So gelatinization, we're not talking about like I made a stock out of chicken bones and let it get cold and then it turned into a gel. We're
Mm.
talking about like we started with solid, maybe not hydrated grain
Mhm.
and went from a solid to a gelatinous mixture.
Yeah.
It's not going to break and turn into like a water-like texture at some point, or at least that's not a useful thing.
Yeah, it's not so when I'm talking about gelatinization, it is the creation of a sugar or a starch, a watery starch, a hydrated starch. That is the gelatinization step.
Okay.
And then gelatin once a starch has been hydrated and properly gelatinized, it is able to be attacked by enzyme to do a saccharification or to turn it into sugar. Drifting gelatinization temperatures in barley, and I see Caitlin just joined and she can probably talk about this as well, but drifting gelatinization temperatures in barley will have an effect on one efficiency, but also have an effect on how your mash acts, how it operates, how you operate. There's also you've got this peak perfect temperature to gelatinize all of the starch. And let's go to bourbon for a second, just thinking about it. Corn gelatinizes at a very high temperature. So you have to cook the corn to a very high temperature to gelatinize the starch. And then once it's been gelatinized, then you have to get it down to a temperature that is optimal for the enzyme to start attacking it. So
Okay.
there's a peak temperature, there's a perfect temperature for gelatinization for every grain. There's a perfect temperature for enzyme in general. Traditionally, in barley, single infusion mashing, or traditionally in single malt, you don't always have single infusion, but single infusion mashing has been an acceptable thing to do because the peak temperature for gelatinization happens to hover around the peak temperature for most of your enzymes. For example, alpha and beta amylase. And alpha amylase is the one that breaks down the amylopectin, breaks down these big long chains of starch. Beta amylase is actually what makes the starch into the maltose units, those single sugar units, and it's what really creates fermentability. Beta amylase is on the lower end of the spectrum. It doesn't like hot temperatures. Alpha amylase can handle hot temperatures a little better. However, as gelatinization temperature creeps up, in order to gelatinize, you are suddenly favoring alpha amylase more than beta amylase. So you're favoring or not so much saccharification, but gelatinization and dextrinization rather than saccharification. So
Okay.
we have to think about how. I told you this was going to be super nerdy.
Yeah, this is great. I'm gonna have to watch back and learn from this.
Yeah.
I feel like it's a college lecture right now, and I'm on board for it.
So this is the example of how mashing regimens are going to affect your product. If you're just traditionally mashing at a lower temperature at say 64, 63 Celsius, and your your optimal gelatinization temperature is 65, you're going to lose out on X amount of, some percentage of starch. You're going to lose out on some percentage of sugar. And that's a bad thing, not just because, oh, you're losing out on sugar to convert to alcohol, but when it goes through the still, that stuff burns. And then you get burned notes and burn flavors. Think of it just like, what happens when you take sugar and make it into caramel. There's a point where caramel starts to burn and
Right.
it will happen.
So
However, yeah.
is dextrose particularly unhelpful for the fermentation process?
Absolutely.
Okay.
So yeast are, my old joke is always yeast are assholes.
Yeah.
Yeast really only like to eat certain types of sugar.
Okay.
And glucose is their favorite, but if you give them too much glucose, there's problems. Maltose is what we traditionally feed them the most, and that's what they're best at. It gives them a little bit of work. Glucose is like handing a child sugar.
Yep.
Your child loves sugar.
Yep.
Maltose is like handing them a piece of bread. At least they got to chew it. They got to,
Yeah.
there's some action there. And then you've got maltose, which is a three glucose units. That takes a little bit more chewing. That's like handing, what's a good analogy? I don't know. It's like handing a child a potato and be like, well, you got to boil it first, but you'll get there eventually.
Right.
Hope you figure it
Okay.
out. And then above that, DP4, DP5, higher, most maltose just can't do it. That's the equivalent of
Okay.
showing. That's the equivalent of showing a child a field of barley. You're like, all right, there's your food. They're just not going to get there. They're not going to figure out how to eat
Yep.
it.
Learn how to farm.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
That
Okay.
being,
So I'm surprised that there's so much of a difference. I mean, I'm not an organic chem nerd by any means, but I'm surprised given that glucose and dextrose are isomers, I think,
well,
right?
they're
The
not.
same chemical structure, but like the bond is on a different link or something like that. Like they're pretty similar. Is that not right?
So maltose is two glucoses stuck
Yeah.
together at the 1,4
Okay.
bond. An isomer is something technically different, but they are they are very similar. It's just one hydrolysis reaction different.
Okay.
Yeah. But
And there's a total difference in whether the yeast will process that or how they'll process that.
yeast will process some preferentially.
Okay.
And it's not just the preferential processing, it's secondary things that they make. So we all know that ferments can go bad,
Hmm.
or they can do things. Again, to go back to the giving a child sugar, you hand a child 2,000 calories in sugar a day. Yes, they technically have all the calories that they need for the day. They also aren't going to feel happy or feel good. You
Right.
give them, bread or something a little more complex, they're going to work at it and they're going to create glycogen. They're going to do other things. I mean, glycogen is kind of a different thing, but they're going to create other secondary chemicals, secondary things that create the flavor that we're looking for. You get, yeah,
Right.
On
Okay. Yeah.
on
Yeah.
on the topic of how yeast converts sugar or converts starches to sugar, uh, uh, I'm tempted to not say his name on stream because I don't know. Uh, one
Try to
of
keep our
our
language PG
yeah,
mostly.
one of our Instagram viewers has asked if you add nitrogen at any point in the process to help the yeast process the sugar.
You can. That's an interesting commentary. This is where we get real detailed and real crazy. So nitrogen there's something called FAN in barley, free amino nitrogen, and then there's also YAN, which is yeast assimilable nitrogen. Yeast need a certain amount of nitrogen. They need a couple of different things to survive. There's a certain amount of oxygen that they need, even though they're technically facultative anaerobes, or technically facultative aerobes. They prefer anaerobic fermentation. That being said, if you just give them sugar, which is very common in, you'll see that in moonshine where they're just feeding sugars, or particularly in rum where it's a lot of molasses, which is mostly sugar and there's nothing else. I say mostly sugar. There's a lot of other crap in there, but not a lot of the other things that are useful for yeast. You need to feed them nitrogen. However, for single malt production, for malt barley, the amount of yeast and barley have really grown up together with humanity in a perfect union, or whatever the word is. So there is normally, if you're doing an all malt barley fermentation or mash and fermentation, there's going to be enough nitrogen for them. There may not be other things, but nitrogen is not going to be a problem.
Okay, so for specifically all malted barley, nitrogen is not a problem. Shouldn't be a problem.
Don't quote me on that, because there
Okay.
are varieties that can have low nitrogen, or there can be ways that you can have not gotten enough fan. But yes, traditionally, that's not an area of worry.
Okay. Is this related at all to the concept of low GN varieties of barley?
No, but also kind of.
Okay.
So low GN. So when we talk about low GN or lower no GN varieties of barley, those are barleys that do not create glycosidic nitrile, which is a precursor to ethyl carbamate. Glycosidic nitrile, obviously, says nitrile. It's got a nitrogen in it. There's a lot of nitrogen naturally in the barley kernel and whatnot. If it's not making GN, it's still there. If it is making GN, it's just being made. It's just being made into GN. There's a tangent. They're technically related. That's not something you worry about. You would see more though, like high protein levels means more nitrogen. Protein is equivalent to nitrogen, and so if you ever get something like a COA, and I've got a COA on my phone that I got just before this that I can read off to you, but you'll see a protein level percentage, and then you'll also see a free amino nitrogen percentage, and these are telling you a little bit about how much nitrogen you need, how much nitrogen you have available to the yeast. But
Okay. I think my brain might be saturated on nitrogen talk at this point.
oh yeah, okay.
But Phil, do you have any further questions?
No, just a follow-up from the Whiskey Alberta Scotch Society, which is what the last part of his IG handle stands for.
Mhm.
He knows for a fact that some Canadian distillers are using nitrogen injections to
Yep.
boost yeast productivity towards the tail end of, I'm guessing towards the tail end, right before they start distillation. JP Weiser's being one of them, and I find that interesting.
Yeah. So what I can state to that, and let me go through my brain and see what I'm allowed to say and what I'm not. What I can say is that a majority of those ferments are not using barley, and so things like corn don't have a lot of
Gotcha.
nitrogen. Things like rye tend to have not so much nitrogen, and also some of the ways that those are being cooked and being brought through that system produces issues. So absolutely, yes. If we're not talking about barley, you need to be paying attention to nitrogen. If we are
Okay.
talking about malt barley, traditionally you're probably fine. You're probably in a good place. It's one of those things of like, what's a good way to put it? It's like your car or your engine oil. Yeah, you should check it. You should change it. If the light comes on, definitely do something about it. But most of the time, it's on your day-to-day commute. It's not something you think about for barley. Whereas if it, if you're driving or if it gas, if you're driving or if you're trying to make a corn or a different grain or use a different grain, that's more important. It's going to be like gas or engine heat. You got to think about it. You got to check it constantly.
Gotcha. So the only other question that I have about the way that gelatinization works, and I'll have more after you actually get through that, is so basically the higher, as I understand what you were explaining, the higher the temperature that it gelatinizes at, the lower the efficiency of the beta amylase enzyme, and the higher the efficiency of the alpha, which leads to a lower efficiency at alcohol production and
lower
potential for essentially sugar-ish detritus to end up in the still.
it's going to result in a lower fermentability.
Gotcha.
That's the official term for it. Yeah, as gelatinization temperatures creep up, you have things to think. You have things to think about, and as it stands right now, today, most people are probably fine. But if we continue to have drought and some of the barley varieties that we're looking at to help with that, those gelatinization temperatures are going to get higher and higher, and suddenly people are going to need to be thinking about this a lot.
Gotcha.
So going back to the beginning of this topic,
Yep.
you mentioned you recently had just had this conversation.
Mhm.
I'm curious what prompted this conversation.
Yeah, that's a good question. So as I mentioned, not last week, but the week before last, as we're trying to figure out a time to do this, I was at the Jim Beam Institute, which is at their conference, which was a great conference, a very technical conference, and I really enjoyed it. And there was someone that brought up that they had seen a change in their rye gelatinization temperature, because this is not a problem unique just to barley. This is a problem for this is what grains do when stressed. And currently the environment is stressful for a lot of grain. So we are seeing this happen. We're seeing people that used to be able to mash in at one temperature suddenly say like, hey, my efficiency is crap. My fermentability is crap. And then you're like, okay, well, let's look at, you got in this grain. Was this batch of grain from a particularly like drought stricken or stressed area? Did the gelatinization temperature change on you? Because barley, we've been very lucky in this very tight kind of area of like, 60 to 65 C is almost everything, pretty much everything. You're seeing rye that can be like, oh yeah, it's 62 C to 75 C. That's a wide range. That's a lot of temperature. And if your process isn't designed to be able to reach the higher levels, and your grain is not gelatinizing until the higher levels, that's a lot of energy. That's a lot of heartache, a lot of lost ability. Because keep in mind, partial gelatinization, and then there's something called retrogradation that can happen, where you gelatinize things, you get things kind of gelatinized, and then they start to retrograde back into what they were trying to be because you never got to the temperature. That is oatmeal. Like, that is what you see when oatmeal gets cold. That is retrogradation, and you're like, God, why can't I stir the crap out of this? That breaks pumps, that breaks mixers, that breaks arms. I've seen that. It will stick, and it becomes a problem. So that was kind of where the conversation started. I'll be honest, we've seen it on the beer side. This became a very big topic of concern in the last year because beer worries a little bit more about temperatures and mashing. In distilling, we're worried about kind of getting efficiency and a lot of the sugar and a lot of the fermentability. Beer is worried about not just the gelatinization, but the level of fermentability, because if you have a stout that's tastes like, or that has no mouthfeel, that's because they messed up a mashing temperature, and the dextrins got they were actually low in the mashing temperature, and the dextrins all got eaten by the enzyme. So it became a big issue, and we've seen this in the beer world. And so we talked. It's kind of been on our minds in the beer world, and really relaying that to what's going to happen to distilling.
Okay, so you answered another question I was going to ask, which is what happens if you don't reach gelatinization temperature, which I think is probably that analogy that you gave about the oatmeal. That's the way to reach the audience on what this means.
Yeah.
That was a good touch point to hit on.
Yeah. No, it's gelatinization is key. It's massively important, and if you're not reaching it, you are going to have a bad time, and you're gonna notice. And people always, people always discount like, oh, 5%. Who cares about 5%? The difference between 100 and 95%. I still made an A, right? When you're talking about large volumes of liquid, large volumes of grain, the difference between 5% can be hundreds of thousands of tons of grain, hundreds, millions of dollars. I know facilities and people that have shut down facilities over less than a percentage difference in efficiency.
Yep. It's thin margins, really, producing anything at a huge scale.
Mhm.
If you're talking about whole number percentage differences, that's too much.
Yeah, it's just too much. Yeah.
It's good if it's going your way. It's really bad if it's not.
Yeah, well, in my experience, it never goes your way. It's always
always getting worse.
dialed down.
Okay, so as gelatinization temperature increases,
Mm.
fermentability goes down. What's the net effect on the wash or the beer in terms of flavor, in terms of quality?
So
Or is it just an issue that you need to throw more grain at the problem to get the right amount of alcohol out?
don't throw. I mean, you can throw grain at the problem, but you're compounding the problem. And as gelatinization temperature goes up, it's not so much that fermentability absolutely goes down. It's just you have to think about ways to fix fermentability. There's options. There's plenty of options out there. However, generally, let's say you do have a situation where gelatinization temperature went up, you didn't account for it, your fermentability is down. What's going to happen? One, your yeast are going to actually be more stressed. The osmotic pressure, they've got the sugar around them, they just can't eat it. So there's osmotic pressure situations, there's all sorts of things that cause that, or that can have effects there. In general, you've got sugar, you're leaving sugar on the table. Let's say you were getting 10% out of your fermentation, now you're getting 9.5% out of your fermentation. You've lost 0.5% of alcohol, which that's a lot a lot of alcohol to lose from a fermentation. It goes through a still and it gets exposed. Depending on the still, it gets exposed to an extremely high temperature. It caramelizes on it. It burns. You've got burn flavors that can come through your finished product. That's a worst case scenario. Hopefully that hasn't happened. Best case scenario, okay, cool. You've got a burned caramel crap on your still. I don't know if you've ever burned caramel on a pot, but trying to get it off the pot is a pain in the ass. That lowers your temperature coefficient of that of your heat exchanger or of all of these things. It changes the capabilities of your still. Suddenly, let's say you were able to run a distillation in 6 hours, and now because you've got so much crap caramelized on it's taking you 7 hours or 7.5 hours, or God forbid, you go over the magic number of 8, and if you got hourly employees, they're just like, well, we're done. That can be problematic. You're talking about increased wear and tear on the still because you got to clean it. You probably got to scrub it. Scrubbing, no matter what, takes takes stuff off. The change in fermentation distillate because of the increased stress may cause weird flavors in your distillate or just changes to your distillate. We strive as distillers, we strive for consistency in an imperfect world, and any addition to the inconsistency is a problem. Also, let's say you've got grain. If you have dextrins still left in your grain going out, that's open to other bacteria or microbes that will ferment that and maybe add a toxin to your grain. So you sell it to a farmer, the farmer sells it to cows, the cows die because they ate a toxin. Suddenly the farmer wants to sue you for selling you back, selling back. I mean, every
Yeah, and all this time I was kind of just accepting the idea that spent grain was a perfectly safe source of maybe fiber and protein for livestock
I mean,
because it's completely devoid of sugars, uh
but
theoretically.
until it
but
isn't.
even under the most ideal circumstances, because life finds a way, there are molds and stuff that will grow on anything,
Oh yeah.
and you can end up with just, you know,
But as a large company, you sign a contract and
mhm.
your lawyers are great at
Oh yeah.
predicting things that can go wrong on your side or predicting things that aren't your fault. But if you
Mhm.
something is your fault, it's definitely your fault.
If we can find a way to make this your fault,
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, Phil, now say it again in your best Jeff Goldblum voice.
I don't know if I can do Jeff Goldblum. He's really hard to do.
I'm going to abstain from all.
It's
I'm not a good impersonator.
not an impressions show. Chernobyl fungus for the win,
Uh,
yes, and also the very famous black fungus that grows on ambient alcohol.
yeah, Baldonia. Yeah.
Crazy
I,
stuff.
One of the funniest things that I read, purely from a like little voice in the back of my head going, "Well, what did you sign up for?" is the somebody who moved into a house overlooking an area where there were a bunch of rick houses, that they wanted this wonderful view, and they started noticing the black fungus growing on their fence, and they wanted to sue the homeowners association that they joined, because the homeowners association allegedly didn't warn them that that was a byproduct of the local industry. And it was just sort of a wonderful article of sort of like feeling a little bit bad that this person like sort of walked into this problem that was entirely predictable.
yeah.
and and also that like little voice in the back of your head that goes, you kind of did it to yourself. It's like living on a golf course.
Yeah, do your own research.
By the way, never live on a golf course.
Oh yeah.
I live on a golf course.
Well, I hope you've learned your lesson.
Sorry, Doug.
Hey, it's a thing, but it was a calculated risk, right?
Right.
We went into this knowing that there's a chance that we're going to have broken windows, but we asked around the neighbors. We are not downrange from anybody teeing off, and to the extent that we are, we have tall trees blocking.
Yep.
We're on like the 12th green and right next to the tee off for the 13th that's going away from us. So unless somebody's really, really bad on the back nine,
See, that's what I'm
we're
worried
prob-
about. I think if you're on the back nine, it might be worse. They might. I know some golfers. I have never been
Oh
a
yeah.
golfer, but I know some golfers, and by the back nine, I'm pretty sure they would be very confused on which way they were hitting the ball.
Yeah.
that's possible. Yeah,
If you
it
go
helps
with
that
the
it's a pretty
standard
expensive private
math,
golf course. So
the standard math of X number of cans per hole divided or times the number of golfers, because the longer you're at each hole, the longer you're spending doing the other elements of golf that are very important.
it's the golf course has to have a minimum handicap to keep the cans of beer down. That's the way to go. Clearly, I have no idea what I'm talking about. I don't do golf. So anyway, I'm gonna bring this up on stream now. Have you named a D&D town after Baldonia yet?
You might see that I commented
Yeah.
later. No, I have not, but now it's on the list.
Yeah, and
There-
that's a segue to our new pet project that we're building, which is we now have 3, possibly 4, if you're down, Reade, distillers interested in the idea of doing maybe a monthly Distillers and Dragons campaign live on here.
So I will tell you, yes, I'm always down to play D&D. You are unfortunately a little late on the punch in terms of Dungeons and Distillers, because I have been part of the inaugural Dungeons and Distillers D&D campaign for the last 3 years now.
No, it makes sense that exists.
Yeah.
It's way too obvious.
Yeah. There's a good number of us that play. And actually, I don't know if Joe told you, but before ACSA this last year, and we've done it now 2 years in a row, we rented a house up in Fort Collins and did 3 days of hardcore play before coming down. And then 2 years ago was Astoria. We did Astoria, and we rented a house as close as we could to the Goonies house. And we did 5 days of hardcore play. And yeah, we are very consistent players. You're part of the Society of Spirit. There is the Dungeons and Distillers channel. You can probably round up a few distillers to join in on this.
So the main difference here is you guys are doing that privately, which is great, and you should, because you're putting yourself out there. The right type of people, certainly in the right niches of the internet, will know that there's a market for Dungeons and Dragons content live on stream.
Yeah.
And this audience probably has a significant overlap between people who are interested in distilling and people who are interested in Dungeons and Dragons. I'm just throwing that out there. There's money in the banana stand when it comes to this idea.
Oh, absolutely. And as Caitlin has just said, the nerd runs strong within the distilling community. It's true.
But anyway, that's going to be a side project that comes after, my long list of many side projects already. So I'm gonna leave it to Phil, though.
My pet project.
Phil is the DM. We might even do it on a different YouTube channel just to keep that all clean and separated. And yeah. Anyways.
What I can tell you, Phil, is it may be difficult to get all the distillers together to do a session, but you can always do a session of Dungeons and Schedules.
My favorite game. We played every week. Hold on. This week I get out of work at 5.
Yeah. There's actually a separate Discord for Dungeons and Distillers as well, and literally one of the channels is called Dungeons and Schedules.
Nice.
Yeah, I've been playing it in the first campaign that I've actually played in quite a while before I started playing in a couple of others. Wilds Beyond the Witchlight, that we haven't had a session in 6 or 7 months because just nothing lines up.
Nope. It always works out. I've had like at least 3 campaigns that we started, got like 3 sessions in, and then never again.
Yep. And I want to say the Whiskey Lodge has not had a session for 2.5 years.
Sorry.
That's not your fault.
No, but who's in charge of it?
Problem. Yeah. Oh, you're just the GM. You're not responsible for getting everyone in the same room. Not necessarily. You can outsource. Anyways, since you mentioned Society of Spirit again, maybe we can go into a bit more detail about what that is. So funny enough, I mean, it was all over ACSA, so I'm not surprised that I didn't hear about it from you or necessarily in that context. I was speaking to an editor of some industry magazine. I forget which
Artists
one
in
exactly.
Spirit magazine. That's going to be Brian Christensen.
Yes.
Yeah.
And
he promoted me to senior writer for that magazine.
Nice.
Which is great. He has yet to ever send me a hard copy of it. He's been saying he's going to send me the next issue for years now.
Nice.
I have to
So he's
all.
actually the one that invited me, and my first question was, "Hey, are like non-industry people allowed?" Because I'm an industry attaché at best. I'm an interested and passionate side person that doesn't work in the industry.
Mhm.
So was it okay? Yes, sure. Join. All perspectives welcome. That kind of thing.
Yeah.
Um, I wonder how broadly you'd actually want to advertise that necessarily. We could probably talk about that offline.
Yeah. So, so the truth is, we are willing to take lots of people, anyone either directly related with the industry or uh, that it wants to be related. We're not looking to be like talking about one. We're an inclusive group. We're not looking for people to talk shit. This isn't. That's not what we're there for. We are a group of individuals that want to see the distilling industry get better on all levels, and not just it's one of part of it is better on like the nerdy stuff, or like talking about mastering and stuff, but also mental health. We want to see people. We want to see everyone just do better, because we all do better when we all do better. Rising tides lifts all boats.
Yep.
And you can and I can send it to you. You can post it somewhere if you like. But we have a mission statement. We have a number of kind of comments. We are completely designed to just make the distilling industry better. I honestly don't even know if someone's not directly involved in distilling. I don't know if it's a fun group for them, because all we're really going to talk. There's plenty of conversation on there about like, hey, what kind of boots do you like? I really like these. There's a whole channel dedicated within that Discord to. It's called Tools of the Trade. I technically started it, but like we're comparing Skeletools and like, what's your favorite lock for this thing? All of that.
Yeah. Any little detail. The problem is if you open up those floodgates too much, then the community will go in the direction that the average member of the community wants it to go, right?
At the moment, we do ask that you be either directly in the industry or directly related.
Yep, makes sense. Speaking of mental health in the industry, just want to throw out a little teaser for next week. We're having Sydney Jones from Few on to give us a version of basically the discussion that she had at ACSA about mental health and conscientious consumption, let's say, in the alcohol industry. So that's coming a day before the Whiskey Lodge Dry Week starts, which is next Friday. Assuming that I have my calendar right. Yes, next Friday the 5th. And since I've now mentioned the Whiskey Lodge, I'm just going to throw this out there. The Whiskey Lodge is the place where Phil and I met. It's an enthusiast community that ranges from very new to rather expert, enthusiasts of all levels. But we don't just talk about whiskey. We talk about anything that comes up, because with a fun group of people who have something in common, you'll find smaller groups of people who have other things in common. And you get to having fun conversations about movies, cars, sports, anything you could imagine. So we'll put a link to that as usual in the show notes. Phil might put a link to that in the chat. It's in my link in bio and all that other good stuff. So if you're interested in talking to us directly and not in a time constrained format, that's a great place to talk to us.
Yep.
And of course, producers are welcome as well. We have plenty of producers at this point. I want to say at least a half dozen, maybe more than 10. Those numbers are going up, which is pretty cool. And I guess more and more distillers are on Discord. Society of Spirits is an indication of that, if nothing else.
Yeah, I'm part of it. And what I can say to everyone that is watching is Sydney is one of the most wonderful people in this industry, and she has a great message about just mental health in distilling, and I highly recommend that you guys tune in.
Thanks for that. But let's get back to you. So we've talked about gelatinization temperature, which you might I would class that in with mash chemistry, which is one of the major topics that we said we would touch on. when you said mash chemistry, the first thing that I, as a non-scientific enthusiast of whiskey, thought of is the difference between sweet mash and sour mash.
Okay. Whoa, we want to get the okay.
This I don't know. Is that a deeper discussion or a shallower discussion? Because I feel like that could go either way.
100% yes, 100% no. All right. Before we go into that, I'm going to direct us because we can't talk about that until we talk about some of the other things that we think about. So we've just talked about gelatinization. We've just talked about releasing the starch to create sugar. What we haven't talked about, and what we need to understand is that, yeah, there's a lot of starch, and starch into sugar is the main goal of mashing, but there's a lot of other things that happen. There's a lot of other stuff that can occur. You've got protein in there. You've got a lot of just a lot of other things. You got cellulose, you got hemicellulose, you got all sorts of stuff, ferulic acid, picomeric acid. All of these things are part of what would be called the husk of the barley or the endosperms. There's just a lot there. Maybe 80%, assume that 80% of your grain is starch, but that leaves 20% to be other things. So there are mash regimens, and this is mostly popularized in the German brewers, that are designed to release or change what is that other 20%. Most of these would be called protein rests or proteolysis rests. These are going to release things like I said, ferulic acid or picomeric acid. Those are the two precursors to 4-vinyl glycol and 4-vinyl phenol. If you're a rye producer, 4-vinyl glycol is crazy important because 4-vinyl glycol is what is typically considered to be the source of the spiciness of rye, that medicinal spiciness. There are mashing regimens designed to preferentially release certain things or certain flavors, or hell, sometimes you just have a lot of beta glucans, those are the gumminess, the sticky things in a mash. And if you've got a lot of beta glucans, it can be sometimes difficult to lauter. It can be sometimes difficult to take things off grain or even leave them on grain. So maybe you need to do a beta glucan rest. All of these are important. All of this is important. So making these decisions of what temperatures you're going to let your mash rest at for a certain period of time to increase the enzyme activity to do all of this stuff. Now we kind of got that base. That's a really, really quick overview of talk about the other aspects of mash chemistry. We want to talk about sour mashing and sweet mashing. Sour mashing is a way you can almost track it. You can see how it came from the Germans, because the Germans have forever grown up with Reinheitsgebot, which is the German purity law. It means that you could only add a set number of ingredients to your beer. Well, they learned really quickly how to manipulate those ingredients to get certain flavors and certain chemistries that they wanted. Sour malts is a perfect example. Oh, your certain enzymes and most of your gelatinization enzymes and saccharification enzymes prefer a specific pH. Well, if my water doesn't allow me to reach that pH, if my water is super basic or has a lot of buffering in it, by the way, you need calcium. That's another thing. All that stuff. How do I get around that? Well, in the German brewing tradition, they use something called sour malts to lower the pH. However, sour malts is kind of a waste on the spirit side because it's just sour. Like it's an acidulated malt. It doesn't give a lot of sugar. It doesn't do a lot of things. So they looked around, they cast about, and they were like, what else is sour? Well, the easy thing that's sour is what's coming off the base of the still, what would be called the pot ale or spent lees. That's naturally sour. why not throw it back into the pot? Why not throw it back for a little bit? And you're gonna acidulate that mash to push the pH to the right range, because you need about a 5.2 to a 5.4, maybe 5.6. Whereas, so you're using that. That's the start of it. Also, once things have gone through the still, you've got what do you have in that potting? You've got a lot of dead yeast. And what's better for convincing yeast to be lively than feeding them their building blocks? And their building blocks are dead yeast. Yeast are cannibals. They're totally fine eating each other, and like you got glycogen in there.
It's all just nutrients, right? Single cell nutrient stuff.
Exactly. And so back to your like the nitrogen comment, the nitrogen conversation. When you're doing a lot of corn and you're sour, you need to sour mash, because corn won't really hit, doesn't have the buffering capacity and the acidulatedness to reach the proper pH for proper gelatinization and proper saccharification. But two, you need a nitrogen source, and an easy nitrogen source is the yeast that are already dead in the base. That's an easy way to get some of that protein in. So that's where the sour mashing came in, and it's why you don't see it in beer or in single malt very much, is because barley and yeast have just grown really well together. There was never a real need. Why would you do that? And keep in mind, nitrogen is also one of the major one of the major contributors to like algal blooms, crazy growth. You don't want to give them too much. If you give stuff too much, it'll screw it up. So if you started trying to sour mash with barley, you might actually screw up the yeast, and they're going to go into the Crabtree effect, and then they're just growing, and they're not really fermenting. They're doing other weird crap because they can.
Okay.
A good fermentation is, how do you put it? It is controlled chaos. It is controlled stress on the yeast. If you do not stress yeast, they will not produce what you're looking for. They will do whatever the hell else they want to do. It just won't be what you want. Right. It won't even be alcohol. You'll get low alcohol. You'll get weird flavors, all sorts of stuff. So you want to balance it, and that's kind of, taking back to the sour thing. Sour mashing is really important in some cases, but it doesn't make sense in others.
So that you touched on something that was kind of an observation that I've made. For one thing, there are certain distilleries that really market on the sour mash process. Usually they're bourbon distilleries, from what I've seen. There are certain other bourbon distilleries that, by way of contrast, particularly market on the sweet mash side of things, which is just the opposite. You just don't use the pot ale.
Yeah.
Right. That's basically my understanding, is it's a choice whether or not to use the spent stillage, I guess. Is stillage a different thing from pot ale? Is just another word for the same thing?
So technically pot ale would be what's left over from a double distillation, the first distillation, what would be called a stripping run. Stillage is a reference to also the grain in. Okay. Those are not hard and fast definitions anymore. It used to be a little harder, a little more important. These days, people will use them interchangeably.
Okay, fair enough. So
pot ale, and then there's also spent lees.
Okay, right. So basically, you take something left over from the previous fermentation, the previous process, the previous round through everything, and potentially put it back in to the beginning of the fermentation process, or somewhere towards the beginning of the process. Yeah. That's a sour mash. I guess my question that I don't think I've ever had answered is it particularly important that it is sour? Is lowering the pH of the ferment important, or is it every other part of that that's more important?
The answer is yes and no. I mean, You ask me on and you expect me to give you hard answers. The answer is I'm never going to give you hard answers because there's more than one way to
Great.
see that. That being
This
said,
is my style of answer. I like
yeah,
the give me more information and let me draw my own conclusions. That's great.
If your process if your process is designed to use sour mash and you suddenly cut it out and you do not reach your pHs, you will not have a good time. Your fermentation will be bad and will be off. If your process will naturally reach the pHs without it, that's fine, but maybe you're also low on nitrogen, or maybe you're low on certain other things. There's a big difference between precision and accuracy, and I would prefer a precise product or a precise method way more than an accurate method. Accuracy is the ability to hit the target or hit the bullseye. Precision is the ability to hit the same spot multiple times.
Right.
Even if I'm, I don't care if my temperature probe is 3 degrees off, as long as I know it's always 3 degrees off.
Right. So you're going for, so you said you'd prefer, now that we've made that distinction and reminded ourselves of the distinction between accuracy and precision, you said you'd prefer precision over accuracy.
I'll take precision every time.
Okay. Interesting. Because I could imagine an argument for the opposite, that you'd prefer to be like, let's say at the end of the process, you've got a whole bunch of barrels of aged whiskey that you're going to blend to come up with a product that you might have some target, right? To use that term by analogy and also just the typical term, you have some target for your whiskey, and you want to be centered around that target, even if it's not particularly precise. I could imagine an argument that still allows you to get the target by blending.
Yeah. So this is the thing. You're right. It could. The whiskey's going to make its own target. I mean, the barrels are never going to be consistent, all that stuff. What you want is to be able to give the most precise and the most consistent precise thing into the barrel. The barrels will naturally have a differentiating effect. And more importantly, let's say I was told, or I walked in one day and I said, I want to make a whiskey like Maker's Mark, or I want to make a whiskey like, Jim Beam. And I was completely accurate and I hit that flavor. I hit that exact product. Cool. What have I done? I've made something that someone else does already.
Right.
Now I get to fight behemoths, or we're talking single malt. I guess like Stranahan, or I could pick other more single malt things, but I could pick other. I would rather create something that's unique in mine, and the target's always somewhere else, than trying to hit a target exact the way I want.
Yeah. Okay. Makes sense. So precision. So control over the inputs. Hopefully gives you control over the outputs. The whiskey makes its own target.
Mm-hmm.
You fall in love with what it is. You mark it on the basis of what it is.
Yeah.
You make it the best version of what it can be.
Exactly.
Yeah. So I've started pouring myself some other whiskeys as we've sort of had this conversation. I have an American single malt, which is a column still, which we haven't gotten to that part of the conversation yet, but I just wanted to put that out there, that exists, and we can talk about it if we want to.
Absolutely.
On the note of mash chemistry and sour things, and I'm going to be off base here to some extent. There's nuance, but what I have here is the most recent Westward sourdough.
Yeah.
The Ken's Artisan sourdough. So this obviously is not a sour mash process, because that's not what they do there. But it's sour in a different way from a different source, that they're using the sourdough levain as a starter for their fermentation, which means that they're producing bacteria which are producing that in bread. It would produce your sour taste in the sourdough. In whiskey, it does a similar thing in fermentation.
Yeah.
Apparently, it smells horrible.
Oh yeah.
But besides that, given the context of this conversation, how similar or different would you expect that approach to be to lowering the pH of your mash and the outputs that you would have?
It's going to be night and day difference. That's a big difference. Because you're talking a sourdough, you're talking about lactic acid bacteria, LAB. They are going to be active. That's biologically active. Whereas a sour mashing using using pot ale is non-biologically active. You've boiled the hell out of that. That's not good. Where's it going? Nowhere. That is, I say that. I mean, there's naturally going to be similarities if you're doing that for pH. I don't know a whole lot about what Anna and everyone were doing with that product. I know about it. I just haven't even gotten to taste it. I'm all the way over here in Florida, so I don't always get the westwards even though I'd love to. But there's going to be a significant difference between using a sourdough kind of thing and a sour mashing situation.
Right. And that biological activity is a big part of what makes a difference.
Yeah.
And also why it smells so bad, because we're not taking something that's just sour. We're taking something that's bacterial byproducts are a part there, and probably the odor and so on. Yeah. But I guess fundamentally, am I off base to suggest that there is at least some kind of similarity between like a bourbon sour mash and a sourdough starter sour mash?
I don't know what they were aiming for there.
Okay.
So I can't say. If they were doing that, if they were using a sourdough specifically to hit a mashing regimen, that's a different thing. But I don't believe that they were, just based on what I'm hearing.
I think it's just a fun project. It was a let's see what happens kind of thing.
Yeah, well, I would assume that it's fermented with sourdough yeast and stuff. Fermentation, I mean, we're out of mash. That's no longer important.
Right.
I mean, I say it's no longer important. It's massively important, but it's no longer the thing that's actively changing the product.
Right. So there's obviously many levers that you can pull in the process of going from grain to glass.
Oh yeah. I mean,
so is there so out of what we've talked about today so far, is there any particular thing that you think there's an appropriate compensating lever down the line that you can stay on your precise target even as things like gelatinization temperature are increasing or other parts of the process might be uncontrollably going different?
Most of what we've talked about so far has been about efficiencies or doing certain things. Absolutely, yes. I actually have this joke that I talk about is that brewers, they take the bowling ball and they try to aim it perfectly and they roll it down down the lane and hope for a strike. Distillers throw the bowling ball, don't even pay attention to where they threw it, and then run as quickly as they can down the lane and start setting up the pins in front of the bowling ball, hoping that the bowling ball hits all 10. Yes, there are absolutely things that you can change at any given moment. Distillers are able to constantly edit, constantly change things or make decisions about stuff. Is there any one-to-one thing like, oh, we screwed up here, or like we missed this flavor here, so we'll do it here or something? Absolutely not. There's always going to be some difference. However, I make an active decision. Like when things come out of a still, I taste what came out of the still. I make an active decision of what barrels it should go into. When I go to taste it out of the barrels, I make an active decision if it should be left in the barrel for longer or maybe taken out and finished in a barrel, or etc. There are many levers that can be pulled. Some can compensate. There's never a one-to-one.
Okay. So I guess my conclusion from that would be, despite attempts at precision, there's always going to be some degree, right? There's going to be a spread as a result,
Oh yeah, always.
because there's
Oh.
always, if nothing else, your grain is a biological product
Mhm.
that is changing with the seasons, with the weather, with individual practices, just the earth, the farm. Maybe even if you're using commoditized grain, you don't even have control over the farm that it came from.
Yep. In a again, I mentioned this before. We are trying to make a consistent product in an imperfect and inconsistent world.
Right.
That is our job. I will forever never be able to forgive the wine guys for thinking of it first and getting to it first, of being like, oh yes, we have vintages, and the 2006, that's an amazing year. The 2007, oh, that's crap. Asshole. I dealt with the same shit. Like
There's some amount of maybe it's I think it's more common, the trend is to be more common with the idea of vintages via special releases, single barrels, that sort of thing. Whiskey is not the Glenfiddich 12 over and over and over again kind of industry. American craft spirits is a very different landscape.
and I'll show my hand here in this sense of that. I both love and hate that. First off, I came from a brewery background originally. As a brewer, I make the same product no matter how different the hops are. I mean, we have hop issues, but we have hop harvest, we have barley harvest, we have all of these things. Budweiser tastes like Budweiser, and the first lesson that I learned from one of my mentors was, the best thing in the world you can do is make good beer consistently. The second best thing you can do is make bad beer consistently.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, Rolling Rock, argumentatively,
won't name names, but there's a number of examples that come to mind.
Yeah.
Very successful brands commercially.
Yeah, well, so Rolling Rock is a great example. I bring it up. It's a famous example in the brewing industry in the sense that it technically had flaws. Like, everyone knew that there were technical flaws in it. And then when AB took it over, they came in, they went to Latrobe Brewery and they're like, oh, no more with this glass tanks. And they're like, we're going to fix all these flaws. And people didn't like it anymore because it didn't taste like Rolling Rock. It tasted like a beer that was technically better, but it didn't taste the same. Right. Whiskey and distilled spirits in general, there's a part of me that wants to make them consistently always. There's also a part of me that wants the grace from the consumer to understand that I can't always be perfectly consistent. Is the answer to that the vintageization of whiskey? Personally, I don't like seeing that because it feels like a failure on my side at being able to be consistent. But it is a way to get consumers to understand that, hey, shit happens.
All right, I've just poured myself a Garrison Brothers because this is the one thing I know I have that's a sweet mash.
Mm-hmm.
That actually markets on that basis. It also happens to be a wheat whiskey, which a wheated bourbon. Very different thing. As you can tell, I don't drink much bourbon, so okay. I mess things up like that all the time. So it's a wheated bourbon, which I buy this because Dad really likes this.
Mm-hmm.
Dad doesn't care about details like that.
Yep.
On the tour, when he goes on the tour and they tell him about the sweet mash, right? That's their marketing. They think that's really important. He remembers that. The fact that it's a wheated bourbon doesn't really mean anything to him in the context of the current climate of allocated bottles and all that sort of stuff, where a lot of them happen to be wheat whiskeys, right? Wheated bourbons. I mean, the fact that this is a wheated bourbon doesn't matter to him at all. Basically, it doesn't matter to me at all, because what this tastes like to me is Texas aged barrels, new oak aged in Texas, right? It has a very distinct flavor. Garrison Brothers is really good at being what they are. I don't know that I necessarily get a difference in the whiskey as a result of it being a sweet mash.
Mm-hmm.
From what I
predominant
know,
flavor in Garrison Brothers is oak. Just if you've never had it, just think to yourself, What would chewing on a chunk of oak be like? There you go.
And not everybody's going to like that, but I will say that they do a very good job of it. They're very good at being Garrison Brothers.
Yeah.
Uh, so on the note of not to go down the rabbit hole of Garrison Brothers specifically,
Yeah.
I brought this out just because it's a whiskey that I happen to have that I know is a sweet mash whiskey. Typically, sweet mash whiskeys will say things along the line of it's harder to be a sweet mash whiskey because you have less control over the consistency from batch to batch to batch. That's the marketing. My question for you, is that actually true in any meaningful sense?
I think it is incredibly hard to have control over the consistency of any batch to batch of any product.
So it's like an equivalent challenge, whether you choose to do a sweet mash or sour mash. It doesn't really.
I will say it's a complicated thing because there are many levers that can be pulled, and having access to like a sour or mashing to even out a pH is technically another tool in the tool belt. But again, it's how you use your tools, and more importantly, I learned this statement long ago, and I repeat it a lot. It's a poor craftsman that blames his tools.
Yep, that sounds right. That rings true. I mean, I would go further to say, as a in a sense, right, as an engineer in my day job, I have tools that sometimes for one reason or another, I'm constrained in the tools that I can use, and that's frustrating. I tell that to other engineers and they commiserate with me. But at the end of the day, the CEO needs me to get the job done and doesn't care that I'm blaming my tools.
Yeah.
That doesn't matter. Find a way to get your tools to work for you or find better tools. That's your responsibility as a craftsperson.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, here's the thing. I'm a production guy. I don't. Every once in a while, I see a marketing thing, and I'm like, oh wow, they glommed onto something that, like, in my opinion, missed the point. Or in my opinion, oh yeah, they glommed onto something. They got it right. Like, oh yeah, they're really paying attention. Good product is good product. I do not differentiate. I do not dislike anything. Anyone and everyone can make good product, and the best product in the whiskey, or the best whiskey in the world, is the one that's in your glass.
Well said. All right. Do we want to talk a little bit about still shapes or still styles? So you were telling me, I believe, or I don't remember if we were live yet or whether this was. I at this point I've lost track. But you were saying that you think about still design
a lot
as like as almost a hobby. It sounds like.
Mhm.
I'm gonna ask a lame question that I know is misguided just to elicit a certain type of response that maybe guides the conversation.
Yeah.
You've got column stills, you've got pot stills. What else is there? What other problems could you possibly be trying to solve? I'm intentionally being inflammatory. I just want
yeah. Okay. Well, yeah. First off, actually,
the viewer numbers just shot up all of a sudden, so that must have been the right move.
Yeah. Yeah, my my heartbeat just went up as well. You want to be inflammatory? Let's start with you. What is a column still, and what is a pot still?
So I'm going to just recuse myself from responsibility because I'm an enthusiast and all I know is the marketing stuff, right? I know what people have told me. I know what I've managed to internalize. So column still to me is a continuous still, if you want it to be. You feed your fermented stuff in, you get alcohol out, and you have a lot of control about what the percentage of alcohol that's going to come out is going to be. You have a lot of control about removing a lot of congeners, impurities from that alcohol, potentially create as pure an alcohol as you want, up to a certain point. And what tends to happen in the whiskey with a column still is that you're going to strip out some more fats. You're going to strip out some more complicated flavors. You're going to end up with something that's a lot. What ends up happening, my sensory perception of what happens with a column still most often, is you get something that is thin and shiny. You get some of those flavors, but really, in the case of a column still, you're getting a lot more flavor from the barrel than you are from the alcohol that came off the still in the first place. And the pot still is a much less perfect process. It's a batch still. It's a batch distillation process where you put a whole load of fermented wash in the still, you run it until it's done, you clean it, you start over. And the way that the still is made lets more imperfections come through. So you end up with potentially a more complex spirit, possibly fattier. And then you have design of the pot still to decide whether you're going to have more or less reflux, and whether it's going to be cleaner or dirtier spirit. And there's a lot of kind of things that you can adjust there. I know that I know that hybrid stills exist, and I know that there's a lot more information out there. I appreciate that there's nuance, and I'm trying to open up the conversation for you to tell me what's more important. What's the important stuff to know?
All right. So first off, we'll just go. This is one of my biggest pet peeves: is people be like, "Oh yeah, batch still versus continuous still."
Okay.
They're not. What is a continue? Like, what happens when you run out of wash on a continuous still? Oh wait, it's a batch still. It's just a big batch. You're just doing a big batch that you're processing small amounts at a time. And there are lots of people to this day that have what people would say like, oh, that's a continuous column still. Like, yeah, it's a continuous column and they run it for 8 hours. How long do I run my pot for? I run my pot for 9 hours. They're both batches. That's just a batch.
Right.
So that's one pet peeve. The other comment is like, okay, you're absolutely right. In theory, a column still, you have this specific control, and you're making decisions about taking this very narrow cut or this very specific cut. However, on a pot still, I can also make a very specific narrow cut, and I can make I won't say a cleaner product. Like, there are some things about getting to neutral and stuff that it's doable, but it's a pain in the ass. It's more of the pain in the ass factor. But when we're talking about whiskey, I could easily make a cleaner whiskey on a pot still by making tighter cuts than I could on a column still that that didn't have as many plate draws. So, like, because you have to choose where you're drawing it off on the plate. Like, if I only have one plate draw, then I'm always getting this, and I can taste it and be like, okay, so I know what's in there, what congeners are there, like what the congener load is, and then I could walk across the street or walk across the way to the pot still and make a super tight cut and make a cleaner product off of it. So the concept of cleaner is not. It's not that it's not accurate. Like, yes, you're right. There is less variability in what you can just do, unless you've got a column still with just a ton of draws, and you can always do that. And there are stills out there that have this. In fact, most of the Scotch and coffee stills will have multiple draws, and you can do a mixture draw. People will be like, oh yeah, I draw 90% from this plate and 10% from this really low plate, so I get these flavors in it. Still, Austin is a perfect example. In Austin, they've got a Michael Delavante still, which they've got multiple draws in the upper, what would be called the analyzer section of the still, and it works quite well. So they can do some very cool things. What I find fascinating about still design is just how much it affects everything. Pot stills is really obvious. You can talk about the line arm position. You can talk about how it's heated. You can talk about the amount of copper contact. You can talk about all sorts of stuff like that. With column stills and what we would traditionally call continuous column stills, you've got plate designs, you've got de-entrainment plates, you've got bubble caps, the amount that it's able to operate. But then you've also got all these other variations, and then all these other variations for like methanol draws and all sorts of stuff. And then there's the cool things in between. The I just saw that as well.
I'll answer that question later.
But then there's all the other cool things in between, which is what some people call hybrid stills, but there's something called the atom still. There's the double. There's what would be what I kind of call nowadays the Barbadian double retort still. I mean, you got the Falca still, which is technically a pot still, but is specifically run in a specific way. You've got the Barbet stills versus the Barbet stills. There's a lot of design and a lot of things, and so you got to look at what you're fermenting and think about what you're getting out of a ferment, and then think about what flavors you want, and you can design a still around, you can choose a still to highlight those flavors. Again, this is one of those levers. People, we were talking about like, okay, so I did do a fermentation that has a lot of sulfur notes to it because I'm dumb in my personal opinion, but you got a crap load of sulfur. Okay, so that tells me I need more copper contact. To remove that sulfur. That tells me I need this sort of thing, or maybe I want some of that sulfur, or maybe I want some of that meatiness. That means I need this kind of condenser or that kind of condenser. It's all these levers, and it's one of those things where the still, for me in distilling, the still gets a lot of credit, but it also gets treated a lot like a black box. Whereas if you really sit down and think about it, be like, there are people that run stills illogically because it's the still that they were given, but they want a specific product. And those are the smart people. And then there's people that just run stills logically, but they're not thinking about it. And then they complain about, well, the still doesn't give me the product I like, but I deal with it. Because they've just never thought to run a still differently or thought to make a cut in a different way.
And back to that precision comment, if you make changes, then you have to deal with that somewhere down the line. And I'll bring this comment up from Freedom Malts. So the easiest way to be consistent is having 500,000 barrels to choose from and blend consistently, craft small batch, etc. are much harder to be consistent. I feel that's generally a true statement.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the solution to pollution is dilution. You can always, if you have a problem, you can always kind of hide it if you've got a ton of stuff.
Right. Which goes back to what I say, that if you didn't have as much precision and you had a lot to choose from, you could average out in the middle at your target.
Yeah, but you never.
It's more complicated than that.
Yeah.
But right. I mean, just last week or earlier this week, I did a big tasting and then I blended what was left in my glasses together and made an old fashioned out of it. I took a sip of that first. It was not good whiskey, right? I took a dozen really good whiskeys, blended them together, and ended up with something that tasted like cellulose capsules and sweet tea, and lost the nuance of every single one of those whiskeys. And it didn't make a good old fashioned either. It's just a bad blend.
Yeah.
So like very different things coming together are not going to get you close to something good. There's not like a good point in the middle that any arbitrary things blended together in the right amounts are going to get you to something good. It's a multi-dimensional space. How much of every single flavor molecule is going to be in that finished product, and how are they going to interact on your palate?
Well, yeah, I mean, there's a reason we, like, when we get into sensory science, we start doing ANOVA like analysis, and we start doing 3D modeling, and you're looking for spaces and niches, and you can see like on a two-dimensional graph, it's very different. It looks one way, but like when you go into 3-dimensional, you're like, oh wow, there's all these other things. Philip, I see that you wanted to say something. Did you?
Oh, so when we were talking about still design, I had a book that I picked up when I first got into whiskey, almost 9 years ago now at this point, that was a sort of adapted, abridged look at pre-prohibition whiskey equipment, and in particular stills.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a diagram of a Maryland 3-chamber still.
Yep.
And I know that there's only about one distillery in the U.S. that I'm aware of that uses one,
Yeah.
but that's sort of a like cool nerdy, like the difference between a column still and the 3-chamber still, and like how they produce different products despite an outwardly, like, if you don't know anything better, sort of similar appearance.
Yeah. So the 3-chamber still is a really interesting still. And I am by no means an expert on it. I would highly recommend talking to Todd Leopold, who is the gentleman I think you're referencing.
Yeah.
That's using it. I know there are some other facilities that are looking into getting them, and there's one down in Barbados that has a Vulcan, which there is kind of a 3-chamber. Um, I I haven't. I actually got to see that a couple of months ago, but I don't have a whole lot of information on it. Um, that is a weird hybrid in between. You can once you start, if you study a lot of still design, you'll be like, oh, I see exactly the thought process that brought you there, and then brought you over there, and then where that went. It is a batch still, uh, very much by
Mhm.
definition. What it is really good at, or what it really is a batch still that operates in some ways under pressure. It's not exactly under. It's not intentionally under pressure. It's just how it's designed to operate with these 3 chambers. And again, I don't want to go into the details of it because Todd can speak to more detail, and he's got a wonderful video on YouTube that I highly recommend you watch. But uh, long story short, the base part of it is creating a lot of pressure, which is forcing some of the oils to come out into the next chamber, which are then being pushed up because there's still pressure. There's pressure on there going up into the 3rd chamber, and you're creating, in some ways, a hydrosol distillation, like an under pressure hydrosol distillation. So you're getting a lot of very heavy, very deep flavors that would not normally come out. And if anyone has looked at distillation curves and azeotrope curves, you know that they're all done at one pressure. And then when you put things under specific pressures, or you do some of the weird things, shit gets funky. Like things get pulled, molecular interactions happen that pull very specific ways. And it's one of the reasons, like, acetaldehyde, technically it boils at like 76 degrees Fahrenheit, except it doesn't it doesn't when it's in a high ethanol concentration, because because you've got the OH bonds happening. That's the kind of stuff that's happening there. That's the flavor that you're getting. It is a smear machine, as some people have called it. It does. It's hard to make cuts on. It's hard to know where you're at, but the flavors and the product that comes off of it are beautiful. And I've got a bottle of the 3-chamber actually over at my house, and I highly recommend trying it.
So
Nice.
this sort of follow up, or I don't think I worded it correctly. Would Does that fall into the category of a hybrid still, because it's sort of not really a pot still and not a column still?
Yeah,
Because the understanding of a hybrid still that is sort of in the common consumer like mental image, is basically just a column of plates on top of a pot still.
yeah. Yes, it is a hybrid still. I classify it as hybrid dash other. I don't really love the term hybrid still just to begin with. I think it's not a fair and accurate representation of what the stills are.
It
But it
assumes
is
a continuum where column on one side and pot on the other, and there's no other way of designing a still.
exactly. But it is there's a time I probably would have called that an antique still, something that doesn't exist and like has been left by the wayside. It is no longer that, obviously, because people are using them and it's kind of come back into vogue. But yeah, it's like I said, you can see the thought process. If you look at the still designs, you can see like, okay, we're starting here and we did something, we changed it that way. Okay, cool. And then we got there and then we got to this thing. And then we kind of took it a step further and a step further and further on. Yeah, I don't know how else to put that.
All right. Before we move on, I'm going to answer this question, assuming this person is still here. My logo is a combination of this whiskey tasting glass with a small coffee cup called a demi-tasse. I hope that answers your question. And I found that comment very funny. And what I will say to that I mean, I'm not going to repeat it because it feels like that could only be a bad thing for my branding. But what I will say is that I am strongly considering a rebranding for many reasons, and that the logo being hard to recognize is one of those reasons.
Yeah.
Although I was very proud of it at the time. I did that sketch and asked a friend in the Whiskey Lodge to turn it into vector art, and it came out as well as I could have hoped. So
I'll make you feel incredibly better real quick with a comment, and I hope that everyone has as good a friend as I had in this situation. There was a time where I was working in Texas, and I had a still, and I really liked the still, and I went, and it was an alembic style still, and I was like, oh man, it would be a really cool tattoo. I'd love to get a tattoo of the Come and Take It flag, the Texas Come and Take It flag, but with, instead of the cannon, put the still on there. And I went to my friend who was a tattoo artist, and I was like, hey, would you design this for me and come out? And she designed it, and she calls me, and I come down and I look at it like, oh, this is really cool. And she says, hey, before you do this, I need to tell you from a distance, it looks a little like a butt plug.
Yeah, I saw where this was going. Yeah.
And I was like, damn it. I really like this. Well, I guess I can't get this tattoo. So you never feel bad, because that's still my worst story of like, oh.
Yeah. At least you didn't go through with it first, right?
Yeah, exactly. Well, at least she was like, hey, just before you do this, like, I need you to.
Yeah.
And then once she said it, I couldn't unsee it. I was like, damn it.
Yeah.
Also, I see.
Okay. Yeah, so we have another question on topic. So what do you think about wooden stills? I know there's at least one wooden pot still and one wooden coffee still used in a rum. Thanks for the question, Freedom Woods.
Yeah, there's actually quite a few. You'd be amazed at the number that exists, especially down in South America and in the Philippines and stuff like that. I would say wooden stills for a time used to be more popular than metal or copper or things like that. There are a number of issues with wooden stills. Issue number one is the safety. I mean, it's just not safe. It is, yeah, just because it's been used for a while and just because you haven't had a problem yet doesn't mean that it's gonna, your local fire inspector is gonna be like, all right, that's cool, yeah, whatever. They do wear out. That's the whole point. Like, you got to constantly fix it. You got to repair it. You got to know what's going on. If you're looking for copper contact, obviously every wooden still has copper in it for the sulfur catalyzing reactions, as well as some of the other requirements. So are you saving money? Yeah, but are you going to spend all your money, one, repairing the wood, two, arguing with the fire marshal, and three, like, you're still spending money on the expensive parts. Like, really, the outer casing is not the thing that's the most expensive. Do they create interesting flavors? Yeah, sure. Why not? Are they that different? Especially because I would hazard the guess that you won't notice a real flavor difference between a wooden still and a still made out of metal, unless you have different heating methods. The heating method is probably going to be the thing that makes the flavor difference. It's not going to be the body is just the body. Every wooden still, it's just the body, and then you still got metal on top. You got copper, you got stainless, you got whatever.
Right. My biggest concern with a wooden still, I wonder how much you know about like the construction, how they dealt with these problems. My biggest concern with a wooden still would be you're putting it's a lot of heat, sure, but that's not good. It's not like it's going to catch the wood on fire unless you don't have a properly shielded heating element. But my biggest concern, I think, would be that you got a lot of pressure in there in a still, and it seems to me like it'd be a lot easier to have a pressure tight container made out of metal than out of wood. Considering, I think it's like at least 3 to 5 atmospheres worth of pressure in the still.
I mean, it depends. It depends on the still. It depends on the operation and a number of things. But yes, that's the safety issue.
But it's not like a huge amount of pressure, but it's still enough that you wouldn't want to be next to it when it blows.
Yeah. Don't be next to stills when they blow up. It's that's a good life
advice right there.
Let me write that down real quick.
Write that down, yeah. Okay, so we're at 2 hours. In the interest of your time, and thank you very much for giving us so much of it. Let's maybe try to wrap up this conversation now. And let me just ask, I guess, across. So I reached out to you in the context of you know a lot of things about the industry, lots of different styles of whiskey, beer, and other products in the alcohol industry. But I reached out to you in the context of I'm an American single malt focused show.
Yep.
So, and a lot of the examples today were American single malt. And by the way, for what it's worth, my example of a column still American single malt was this Devil's Share from Cutwater. It's one that I happen to know is a column still, and it has a very crafty flavor to it, right? There's a very grainy, beery flavor to it, despite the fact that it's made on a column still, which I don't usually expect. I expect a column still to the failure mode of a column still. I expect to be that it becomes bland.
Yeah.
So that aside, just to like bring that up and say that's what my example was. We didn't get a chance to talk about it. That's fine. So my question for you would be, if you were designing an American single malt product from scratch, based on the conversations that we've had today, what decisions would you make in constructing your product?
Ooh, you are asking a very difficult question. Because there's this part of me that wants to say, you know, there's always going to be the part of me is like, you can say, oh, money has no object. And I'm going to hear that and still not be able to break my, like, I have to, this has to make money. This has to be ridiculous. The answer is that if money truly had was no object and I could do whatever, I'd have every still physically imaginable running that. I'd also have a mash press, a mash filter. I'd have a louder ton. I'd have a MTLT. I'd have just a grist, just a cereal cooker. I'd have a lot of things, and I'd be messing around with all of it because, again, back to my comment of the best whiskey is the whiskey that's in your glass. There are ways to make good product on all of them. I am classically trained. I'm a classically trained Scotch guy. I drink a lot of single malt. I went to school in the UK. I'm probably gonna go SWA style, and I do an MTLT, mash tun, louder tun, relatively shallow bed. I filter it off. Go into two pot stills. Not even Loman stills, like just big old pot stills with declining line arms, no purifier, and probably a worm tub because I really like that meaty flavor. But that's me. That's my whiskey. That's not your whiskey. That's not the whiskey that I think is gonna gonna conquer the world. That's just the one that I want to make.
For what it's worth, I would buy that whiskey on the specs alone, right? That transparency, if I had the transparency into your brand to know those decisions that you had made, even without rationalization for those decisions, I largely agree with them. I mean, there's other decisions I could get behind as well.
Yeah.
But that set of decisions appeals to me. I would buy that whiskey.
Well, I appreciate that. You and I can buy the. You will be my only customer, and yeah.
Just don't tell me the price, because as long as we're saying price is no object, I don't want to know what it's going to cost.
Yeah. You're let's just say you don't pay with money.
Yeah. Yeah.
Unfortunately, I can't.
We also have, yes, I would drink the hell out of that. And you and I are on very similar pages, he says.
Oh. Philip,
Go
what were
ahead,
you
Phil.
saying?
I was going to say, unfortunately, I can't pay rent with somebody's soul. So,
Well, wait until you find it. You might be able to. Who knows? Capitalism's got some ends, right?
oh yeah.
So I think on that note, unless you had another comment to add. So on that note, since the only way we're going to achieve this whiskey is if we achieve a post-scarcity utopia, so I think we'll cheers out on utopia. So here's to utopia. Reade, thank you so much for your time. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
Yeah,
You've given us so much information.
Thank you so much for sitting down with me. It's always fun to get to nerd out.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know that my audience appreciates this, and I know that I'm going to have to go back and listen to this again so that I can properly learn everything. Because one time was not enough. I'll just say that. So once again, to utopia and making the decisions that with money is not an object. So cheers. And until next
Sláinte.
time, I'll see you in the lodge.
Yep. Sláinte.